Kensington Palace made a brief but very unusual announcement not long ago, one that arrived with no explanation, no background, and no hint of what was to come. The British media quickly realized that this was much more than just a standard update. Information started to emerge in bits and pieces, which soon came together to form a disturbing story. The disgraced ex-wife of Prince Andrew, Sarah Ferguson, has been spotted resurfacing near Queen Camilla quite suddenly. Additionally, Camilla has abruptly distanced herself from a number of prior verified public appearances, abandoning duties she has continuously upheld since ascending to the throne. At the center of this developing chaos, King Charles is reportedly involved in constant behind-the-scenes activities. Discussions with legal representatives. According to reports, he has shut down his private library, stopped speaking to the media, and isolated himself in a way that is uncommon, which led royal analysts to declare the situation a crisis right away. Now the focus is on Prince William and Princess Anne, whose names have been unpredictably dragged into discussions about power, reputation, and influence. What is Camilla's actual position in all of this? Is she a victim of the situation, or is the strategist music behind the scenes planning what happens? And will the decision that King Charles is getting ready to make ultimately maintain the monarchy or shatter his family in the face of the world's unwavering scrutiny? As it pressed against the old stone facade of Buckingham Palace, the December mist that hung over London felt sharper and heavier than before. However, the icy tension that permeates the palace pales in contrast to the cold outside. Hallways with red carpeting. In the very heart of British power, where every action was planned and tradition controlled every moment, a deep upheaval was taking place in silence, sparked music by the headlines of the day. Inside music, his private library, King Charles, who had been waiting for the St. Edward's crown for over 70 years, sat still in 2023. The monarch, who is 77 years old. Known for his meticulous routine and sporadic outbursts of annoyance, he exuded an unsettling serenity. Inexplicably, his previously well-planned schedule had been completely destroyed. Regional visits, appointments with government officials, and ceremonial responsibilities had all been eliminated in favor of a constant stream of senior assistants and legal counsel. There was obvious tension on their faces. There was anarchy outside the oak doors that were locked. Presses ran constantly, and newsrooms from Fleet Street to New York buzzed with urgency. The Times took the lead with a subdued yet eerie headline. At the palace, there was an unusual silence. Less subtly, the tabloids began launching hostile and coverage that is speculative. The abrupt disappearance of Queen Camilla soon became the main topic of discussion. She had suddenly distanced herself from public life after enduring decades of public animosity and controversy to become the king's consort. The seat next to King Charles was noticeably empty at memorial services and important diplomatic events, a void that sparked a lot of conjecture. Her past was reviewed by commentators. Resilient and motivated woman who had patiently awaited her current role. Her silent retreat appeared to be a carefully concealed rupture rather than a sign of discretion. Soon, a concept that had seemed unthinkable just months before was boldly explored in the headlines: abdication. Every apparent change was scrutinized by political observers. The focus shifted to Prince William, the Prince of Wales, who had become increasingly visible. William was portrayed in recent photos as the personification of continuity and the future of the monarchy. In a calm but obviously troubled manner, now in his 40s, he was seen as a man bearing the full weight of the dynasty rather than as a young man in waiting, according to reports. His frequent visits to the King's office indicated more than just regular backing. It alluded to an urgent handover of power intended to stabilize the palace apparatus as it stumbled within. Public anxiety permeated streets and conversations beyond newspapers. Britain, this felt different. Even though royal turbulence was nothing new to the country, it wasn't a dramatic split or a personal scandal. There were clear indications of a constitutional emergency. An experienced Guardian columnist who had been covering royal affairs for a long time ended his analysis with a sentence that made the readers shiver. Outside pressure is not the cause of what is actually taking place behind those gilded gates. It has started. From the very center of the royal family itself, silently and brutally, King Charles returned to his study where he gazed at a framed family photo while lowering the newspaper. Faces with smiles appeared oddly changed. Now under a cloud of bitterness, the world was only seeing the tip of the iceberg, the fallout from events that started exactly 1 week prior. His mind strayed back to the moment when his blind faith started to erode. It had been a dismal Tuesday afternoon when Prince Edward, his quiet younger brother, came into the room with a look Charles had never seen him wear. An agonizing combination of pure honesty and devotion. This was not an accident. The media correctly identified a crisis, but they were completely wrong about where it came from. A secret meeting, an unlikely alliance, and an ambition so great that it threatened to eat up the throne itself were the true causes. The dynasty was on the verge of either a new chapter or irreparable ruin, as the palace clock continued to tick steadily. The king closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to that fateful afternoon a week before, when the real conspiracy had quietly started, 7 days prior to the shocking headlines. Showed up in every major newspaper, a seemingly insignificant event had taken place. It was a Tuesday afternoon under the dreary, overcast skies that are so typical of London's outer suburbs, far from flashing cameras, royal escorts, and the continual surveillance that surrounds palace life. Quiet, cautious, and perhaps the most modest of the Windsor siblings, Prince Edward, Duke of Edinburgh, was driving alone through peaceful, almost empty streets. Edward treasured these infrequent periods of freedom and unprotected time. Convoy following in his wake, they grounded him in a world that still felt real by reminding him of life outside the palace's fortified walls, and frequently, coincidence turns into the catalyst that ignites tragedy. Edward tensed abruptly as his car slowed close to a tiny, vintage cafe that was tucked away behind tall trees and far from the bustling center of the city. Almost by chance, he noticed a familiar face getting out of a regular civilian car. It was Sarah Ferguson, the ex-wife of Prince Andrew. Despite her long-standing divorce from Andrew and her lack of official status in the royal family, Sarah continued to be a highly contentious figure connected to scandals and behind-the-scenes music connections. Edward observed right away that she appeared remarkably unobtrusive. She was dressed simply, with a big scarf drawn up to hide most of her face, and she moved quickly and carefully. Not at all like her famed attention-seeking personality, but it wasn't Sarah's appearance that really made Edward's heart race. The woman was the one. Sitting in the cafe, he recognized Queen Camilla through the foggy glass and the faint yellow glow inside. A wave of uneasiness passed over him. Edward was more aware than most that any meeting with the Queen would typically be scheduled in the official calendar, accompanied by at least one private secretary and secured by security guards and music. However, she was here. Alone in a small nook, surrounded by secrecy instead of pomp and smelling of coffee. Despite having a straight back, Camilla's hands were firmly clasped together at the top of the table. A clear indication of stress, concentration, or both. Edward parked far away, protected by the shade of the trees. He could see the two women clearly through the window from there. Warm smiles and casual familiarity were not hallmarks of this type of gathering. There was no easy affection, no laughter. Rather, the conversation carried the keen edge of strategy. For the most part, Camilla spoke. Music, the soft poise she had shown next to the king had vanished, replaced by something more rigid, restrained. Resolute, bordering on harsh, her mouth moved slowly, occasionally forming a thin, unreadable line. Sarah Ferguson appeared to be across from her. Torn between excitement and obedience, she nodded repeatedly, sometimes pointing to a narrow pile of papers arranged on the music table or opening a small notebook to jot down notes. Edward felt a chill creep down his back. It was no coincidence that a disgraced former royal, desperate to regain relevance, met in private with a reigning queen who was spiritually influential at the king's side. As if this exchange had already occurred, Edward stood motionless as Camilla carefully slid a heavy envelope in Sarah's direction. He was plagued by doubt. Was he going overboard? Was he prying into his sister-in-law's private life? However, years of observing the Windsor crisis had honed his intuition. This afternoon tea was anything but informal. Only one thing which the king was never supposed to find out could be indicated by such secrecy. Sarah left first when the meeting was over, vanishing swiftly into traffic. Camilla stayed behind for a few minutes, drinking her tea one last time and gazing off into space. When she stood, Edward saw a cold, calculated calculation in her eyes. Next to his brother, then her face reverted to its old aristocratic mask as she stood up and repositioned her collar. Stylish. Calm, fully recovered, Edward's mind went haywire on the drive back to Buckingham Palace. King Charles came to mind, a man who had put all of their trust in Camilla's devotion following decades of conflict. The crushing weight of responsibility and his own health issues were already weighing heavily on Charles. It would be like stabbed into the king's weary heart to express such suspicions. However, the sight of those records, the confidentiality, and the intense passion between it would not leave him. The two women. Edward was aware that silence was frequently another kind of treachery in the royal life. In the event that the throne's future or Prince William's status, the nephew Edward could not keep quiet because he loved music so much. Even the dazzling chandeliers in the palace's grand entrance hall were insufficient to distract him as he entered. His chest was pressed by darkness, his hand hovered over the brass handle as he walked over to the king's study door. He took a slow breath, sensing the gravity of his upcoming statement, because the shaky fragment of their family would be gone forever once this door opened and the truth was spoken out loud. Charles's fountain pen's gentle scratching inside music stopped suddenly. The king raised his head and fixed his tired gaze on his brother's shaky, pale face. They fell into a dense silence that foreshadowed a collapse that no one could yet comprehend. King Charles withdrew into a dangerous silence following his brother's weighty revelation. He had changed from being the patient husband and the man who used to find solace in caring for roses at Highgrove. He became the ruler of a 1,000-year-old monarchy in that instant, facing an attack that had come from within his own personal life rather than from political rivals. Charles resisted any emotional outburst, taking Edward's advice to heart. Rather, the brothers started a covert internal inquiry, carefully and ruthlessly analyzing the very family to which they belonged. They turned a small Sandringham study into their operational center because of its unparalleled isolation. Folders without official markings started to pile up over time. As was his custom, Edward had secretly gathered intelligence from the palace's financial consultants and communications staff. A disturbing story began to emerge from the pieces as documents dispersed music across the polished oak surface. Charles slid a trembling finger over articles taken from smaller tabloids and obscure blogs. At first they seemed innocuous, subtle hints directed at Prince William. The future king's administration of the Duchy of Cornwall charities was depicted as authoritarian. Selectively displayed figures and carefully cropped financial statements suggested that William was covertly enhancing his financial power beyond institutional control. Charles could tell right away how well made it was. No outright accusations, just insinuating inquiries designed music to undermine public trust in the heir's moral character. The following thread focused on Princess Anne, who has long been hailed as the most industrious worker in the monarchy. She was now being portrayed as inflexible and invasive, someone who was allegedly meddling too much in the king's judgment. Excerpts from internal conversations that were selectively leaked portrayed them as a barrier to modernization rather than a stabilizing factor. A startling consistency became apparent as the brothers pieced together the events. Shortly after Charles announced changes among senior palace staff, all of the negative stories about William and Anne had come to light at the same time. The goal was the development of doubt rather than a complete coup. Camilla would establish herself as the king's only trusted confidant, thereby ruling alongside him as an unofficial regent as his health declined, thereby undermining Anne's power and diminishing William's legitimacy. Music. When Edward showed evidence of coordination, it was the most devastating revelation. By closely examining digital payment trails and communication logs, he discovered that Sarah Ferguson was only the operator in plain sight, making use of. She served as the logistical engineer, actively guiding the dissemination of false narratives through her wide-ranging media connections and shadowy financial networks. Because she was not a member of the core royal circle, the accusations had an air of Of genuineness, however, Sarah was not behaving on her own. Camilla was discreetly sponsored behind her when Charles learned of the coded. Sarah's instructions contained wording that was similar to his wife's unique wording. Camilla had skillfully shielded herself by never being directly involved in transactions or correspondence, providing Sarah with the most private internal information that only a spouse could have, and letting her use it. In a strategic manner, like a slow-acting poison, the realization exploded inside Charles, nights when Camilla empathetically expressed sympathy for him regarding William's stubbornness or quietly voiced worries about Anne's music going beyond her authority. Now, every consoling comment came to light as a calculated move that progressively distanced him from the people he had once trusted the most. Charles felt more and more alone in the majesty of the palace as the investigation progressed. His ancestors' portraits appeared to silently jeer at him and accuse him of being blind. He no longer viewed Camilla as his partner, but rather as a cunning shadow hiding beneath the gleam of the crown music. She had not been humbled by years of public censure, they had stoked a desire for power. An introspective examination of the Windsor legacy itself, seeing the destruction in his brother's eyes, Edward stayed by his side. There was no need for an explanation. This was no longer a personal family argument, it was a betrayal of ethics, with intentional. Calmly, with the weight of finality in his voice, Charles closed the last folder. Now his hands were steady, grief had solidified into determination. He realized that he would have to be the one to dissolve his own marriage in order to protect the dynasty his mother had devoted her life to protecting. The king's private room that evening. The oppressive silence that pervades Windsor Castle is a sign of impending turmoil. With his back to the door, King Charles stood at the window, his fitted suit seemingly pressing down on him. His hunched shoulders, he didn't turn when the heavy oak door silently closed behind him and the room filled with the scent of Camilla's lavender perfume, the existence of the woman who had been a part of all his victories and failures now made him shudder. Charles finally turned to face her and placed a dark blue folder on the desk made of polished mahogany. This was not your average paperwork. His faith ended with that. He kept his gaze fixed on Camilla's face. He was shocked to see that there was no desperate plea, no tears, and no panic. With unnerving poise, she faced the evidence in front of her while remaining motionless. She acknowledged without saying anything. The faint, bitter curve of her lips told him everything as she scanned the copies of leaked materials and the photos of her meeting with Sarah Ferguson. The image of the obedient wife and gracious queen was shattered in that moment. It was replaced by a woman molded by past traumas and driven by years of repressed anger. Within Charles, his thoughts clashed violently. One side continued to look for any rationale, no matter how ridiculous, that would protect the woman he had married from public disdain. The monarch, on the other hand, rose with icy, uncompromising power. He saw unwavering defiance rather than regret in Camilla. As though asserting her ownership, she started to pace slowly while her fingers touched precious artifacts. Charles saw all the grievances she had harbored for decades in her cold gaze, being branded a home wrecker, suffering from public contempt, and going to court. Rejection, and continuing to live forever under Diana's imposing legacy. Camilla did not refute the charges. She was aware that Edward's indisputable evidence would cause all excuses to crumble. Rather, her silence revealed a harsh reality. She had taken all of these actions to protect herself. She was resolved to make sure Charles was gone. She would never be forgotten. It was more than just an attempt to gain influence to undermine William and Anne. It was retaliation against a family that had never accepted her completely. She aimed to make the world recognize her authority by taking charge of the monarchy's future. No voices were raised during the altercation, only labored breathing and maintaining eye contact. As the emotional distance between them grew unimaginable, Charles moved closer, bridging the physical gap. Music. He was at the end of his internal battle. He could preserve the appearance of his marriage by keeping the truth hidden, but doing so would mean betraying William, Anne, and the monarchy as a whole. He would destroy the reputation he had worked so hard to establish for Camilla and expose himself to international disgrace once more if he spilt the beans. Then his eyes found Queen Elizabeth II's portrait on the wall, and he suddenly realized what was happening. All personal loyalty was subordinated to the crown's duty. Secret intrigues fit for medieval courts could not undermine the legitimacy of the monarchy. Charles took a step back, a subtle but firm rejection. Camilla appeared to grasp it right away. Despite the absence of regret, her defiant gaze changed to one of stark isolation. Composed, she erects her shoulders. And aloof, music, ready to accept the repercussions of her deeds. Charles stopped talking. Rather, he grabbed the bell to summon his personal secretary. Any possibility of reconciliation was eliminated when he gave the order to set up a live, televised speech for the next morning. It was a brutal choice that sacrificed one's happiness for the moral authority of the throne. Charles was left alone in the large room as Camilla was led away under covert security. It was like 10 years had gone by in one night. The king started writing the first few words of a declaration that would be heard around the globe in the faint light of the corridor lights. This path had no way of return. The throne called for sacrifice, and Charles decided to pay with his own heart for music this evening. A somber shroud of grey clouds covered London on the morning of the announcement. The harsh glare of contemporary television lighting in the state dining room of Buckingham Palace contrasted sharply with. Above the elaborate historic ceiling fresco, the tension in the air was oppressive. Even seasoned reporters who had grown up with royal pageantry felt there. Catch your breath, just the setup told us that something was seriously amiss, just a simple wooden lectern with no ceremonial color or floral arrangements. Standing by himself in the middle of the room holding the royal cipher, music, King Charles entered when the tall doors eventually opened. He wore a dark blue suit that was immaculately cut, but no ceremonial garb. Had a solemn gravity, his slow, methodical steps reverberated throughout the floor, music like a blow to the monarchy's very destiny. His eyes were tired, and his face was deeply wrinkled from sleepless nights and music. But within them blazed a ruthless resolve, the expression of a man who had transcended suffering and duty. Millions of screens around the world went silent. Charles didn't provide a lengthy introduction. As he started, his steady, low voice filled the room. The customary diplomatic tone had vanished. Rather, he delivered his words with the exactness of a magistrate. He laid out the facts, one by one, fabricated stories intended to damage Prince William's reputation. Concerted attempts to discredit Princess Anne and intentional mismanagement of royal charity funds. An invisible tremor shook the room as soon as he said Camilla's name. He didn't say "my wife" or refer to her as the Queen. By calling her Camilla, he purposefully stripped her of her status in the naming process. Her partnership with Sarah Ferguson was characterized as a grave challenge to the legitimacy of the throne rather than a personal family issue. Copies of secret communications and handwritten notes appeared behind him, projected onto a large screen. It was impossible to deny the evidence because it was so clear. The next sentence was, quickly, in succinct, incisive statements, Camilla's permanent exclusion from the British royal family was declared by Charles. All of the Crown's privileges, protections, and titles were immediately withdrawn. She was given a 24-hour notice to leave all royal homes and withdraw into a closely monitored private life. The king was unforgiving of Sarah Ferguson. Dossers described financial crimes in detail and formerly, the Metropolitan Police had been tasked with looking into subversive activities. Charles was not angry or resentful during the speech. What was most chilling was the complete lack of emotion. It was obvious that he had broken off all contact with the woman he had loved. He made the decision, by himself under the burning lights, to reveal corruption in his own family to maintain the monarchy itself. Prince William watched his father out of sight through a small gap in the doorway. His hands were clenched tightly and his jaw was tense. He saw a man tearing down his last emotional haven so that the way to the future throne would not be tarnished. It was a cruel kingship lesson. Wearing the crown occasionally requires one to be brutal with one's own emotions. Camilla sat motionless in front of a live television broadcast somewhere else in Windsor Castle. She let go of the remote control and hit the ground when it was announced that she had lost her titles. In less than 15 minutes, she lost the prestige and power she had fought for and endured decades of disdain for. She didn't cry, rather a silent collapse occurred inside, a woman deprived of all that she had struggled to acquire. Charles left before the broadcast ended to take questions. He turned and left the room right away. There was an uncanny silence as the lights went out one by one. Commentary erupted from analysts all over the world, but only the weight of a landmark decision remained in that chamber. The king's verdict had been delivered. Since then, Camilla's world had come to an end, and a new era had begun, ushered in by the painful sacrifice of a man who had personally signed his wife's exile sentence. Following the seismic press conference, there was no chaos at Buckingham Palace. Rather, it descended into a chilly silence, akin to a graveyard following a fierce tempest. As usual, the formalities of royal life went on. However, a fundamental shift had occurred. The once glorious hallways were now filled with the somber air of purification, disintegration, and a harsh new beginning, in one of Windsor's securely guarded wings. Camilla was last seen at Castle before going into permanent exile. The title of Queen, the elegant hats, and the jewels were gone, wearing only simple clothing. She was dressed in dark clothes and had a ghostly pale complexion. She packed the last of her personal belongings into a small suitcase with shaking hands. Looking at herself in the mirror, she hardly recognized herself, a victim of overly ambitious ambition. Everything in her immediate vicinity evoked the recollection of a golden past. Finally, Camilla realized that the power she had craved was merely a delusion maintained by her husband's confidence. Without that confidence, she was merely an outsider removed from the flow of history and no longer considered royalty. Her seclusion was not a passing phase. She had accepted it as her sentence. Sarah Ferguson faced an even more severe fate in another high-ranking judicial position. The former Duchess of York sat across from investigators, surrounded by thick case files without diplomatic immunity or royal protection. Files, she realized that she had never really been in control, and the excitement of being a mastermind had vanished, replaced by sheer terror. Far away, she was just a piece on a board. Greater than herself, the repercussions of her greed and resentment now threatened to close in on her like bars in a prison, leaving her with nothing but a lifetime of mistakes that could never be undone. King Charles sat at the center of this shifting order. His silhouette stretched long in the one winter afternoon as he stood alone in his library. The king looked older, his face etched with deep lines of betrayal. He carried the solemn dignity of a monarch who had protected the dynasty's honor against its most perilous internal storm in decades, despite the private suffering behind his eyes. However, the cost was complete. At the expense of extreme loneliness, Charles had ensured the monarchy's survival in his later years. He had demonstrated the fact that the crown is not an ornament of glory but a chain, one that requires the most intimate things to be sacrificed. Still, a dim new light started to emerge from the wreckage. Now Prince William took the stage in a new capacity. In a ceremonial broadcast, not a coronation but just as significant, William was the embodiment of what would follow. There was no doubt in his eyes. He had a respectful but sad outlook on his father, but more than anything, with unwavering determination, William recognized that his time had to start with transparency, reform, and an unwavering dedication to the people. He had developed into a link between the promise of stability in the future and a turbulent past. Prince Edward stood nearby in silence like a faithful protector. The individuals. There was no need to honor those who had quietly averted a historic disaster. His family's survival was sufficient compensation for him. His moral character had been Charles's last hope during his darkest hour. Following the incident, London's main special editions of newspapers were hurried out. Instead of scandal, the headlines changed to thinking. Will William be able to start a new chapter soon after King Charles abdicates? Perhaps the answer was no longer important, but the question still persisted. In the public's hearts as spiritual, there had already been a transition. Although the House of Windsor had survived it would never be the same again. From the ashes of the previous era, a new one had betrayal based on the bravery of a mourning monarch and the optimism of the next one. Upon hearing this, what do you think of the story? Was it King Charles' choice to come clean? Openly the deed of a shrewd and resolute ruler, or the heartless, icy husband who put the survival of the dynasty ahead of his own feelings? Leave a comment below with your opinions. Remember to share, like, and for more, subscribe. Additionally, make sure to click on the next video that shows up on your screen. You'll like it.